All right, everybody, welcome back to another edition of Review with Bear's Guide 205. This time we are tackling Unit 5, the Agriculture Unit, all on its own. And we know this year it was an absolute monster tackling this with all the new information and all the changes, but we're going to get through it. We're going to be fine. As always, I want you thinking about, do I remember this stuff? And if I don't, I really need to focus on it. But also, how does this connect to the other things that we have talked about? When we talk about population, migration, culture, ethnicity, or political geography. So let's jump right into it. So right away, a lot of topics to cover, but let's not get intimidated. So right away, we have to start with the hearth of agriculture, the start of agriculture. Well, this guy Carl Starr came up with the theory, the vegetative hearth theory, this idea that as we are pastoral nomads roaming around trying to find food, we realized that as we were picking food, parts of the plants were falling off, and when people came back, they were like, oh my God, there's more plants here, there's more food here, this is amazing. And then eventually we got the bright idea of putting seeds into the ground and growing food. I know it doesn't seem revolutionary, but this idea that you can have a steady source of food from the environment convinces us not to move around as much anymore and start to build society. So the hearths of agriculture, you got to know where it started, and it starts all around the world independently. It's not like one person discovered how to grow food and then walked around the entire planet telling other people how to do it. Individual civilizations discovered this through the Fertile Crescent, the Indus River Valley, Southeast Asia, and Central America. Specific crops to regions: corn, Central Mexico; wheat to Turkey; rice to East China; potatoes in Peru; and taro in New Guinea. What do all these things have in common is that they're starchy foods. You can grow a lot of them, store them for a long time, and they provide a lot of carbs, energy, and overall calories to start civilization. And here's just a picture showing the hearths of agriculture where they started and what they grew. So then we eventually, over time, get to this Columbian Exchange. And while Christopher Columbus is definitely a terrible human being, and him discovering, quotation marks, the New World led to the genocide of millions of people, luckily we got some new food out of it, so that's exciting, right? So here's a picture here just to give you an idea, and from this point, this is where all the foods that we know today, especially associated with certain regions, is even possible. None of the food that we expect to eat every single day wouldn't exist without the Columbian Exchange, without the movement of this food across hemispheres. So this leads into changing agriculture, changing society, changing civilization as we know it. Now, you have to know your agricultural revolutions, and this is a very basic, very, very basic breakdown of the agricultural revolutions, and I would encourage you to look at your agricultural revolution notes or foldable, because you'll get more information out of that. But what you have to understand is the differences between these three revolutions. The Neolithic revolution is us starting to farm. We are finally putting plants into the ground. The second agricultural revolution is tied into the Industrial Revolution. We are starting to build all these machines and factory-style lifestyles, and a lot of people are moving from the rural areas to the urban areas where they're going to go work in factories, and they can't farm anymore. So now you have all of this land that's available. You have these really expensive machines that can harvest lots of food all at once. So it's like the perfect storm for having not a lot of farmers in what would be the developed world after the Industrial Revolution, using machines to harvest food to provide for all the people living in cities. Then, most recently, you get the Green Revolution, which took place in the mid-1900s, and now we're going to introduce more science into farming. Things like GMOs, irrigation technologies, different seeds that can have a higher yield for food. And this changes the game for the entire world, because now the entire world can produce a lot more food. But there are drawbacks of that also. So when we talk about agriculture, the most basic way to divide agriculture is between commercial and subsistence, right? So understanding the basic differences between these things will help you understand other types of agriculture. The purpose of commercial agriculture obviously is to sell. Yes, they consume some of the stuff, but generally these farmers are going to sell all of their product. While in subsistence agriculture, what you're growing is intended for you to eat, and if there's anything left over, you might sell that off or you might trade it. Now, number of farmers, in commercial agriculture, you're going to have a very small number of farmers, generally in a developed country, because they have to spend more of their money on machines that then take care of all the land that they have. Whereas subsistence agriculture has a lot of farmers because they don't have access to those machines or they don't have the money for those machines, and a majority of people in the developing world are still farming on small farms. That's where it takes us to machinery, where, as I mentioned before, commercial farming relies a huge amount on technology to harvest all of this food, while in subsistence agriculture there's very little reliance on technology, and it's generally more labor intensive, and people are working with hand tools and stuff like that. Then we get to farm size. Now, because there's such a small amount of farmers and the machines are so expensive, the farms have to be as equally as large or extensive, because you have to have enough product to pay for all these expenses going into your different tractors and harvesters and buildings and storage and vehicles and food and blah blah blah. Whereas subsistence farms are generally very small. They're labor intensive, just smaller areas because you're only working with physical labor and hand tools. So this takes us into another way to compare farms, and as I mentioned, there's commercial and subsistence, and I kind of mentioned this, intensive versus extensive. Extensive agriculture is just large amounts of space, really big plots of land, while intensive agriculture is not as much room. Now, farms are big, no matter what. Even intensive agriculture farms are big, but there's a difference between a 1 acre farm and a 100-acre farm, and that's what we're talking about. And then finally, there's capital intensive versus labor intensive. Now, generally, commercial agriculture done in the developed world is going to be capital intensive. It costs a lot of money to run those farms and buy all the equipment, while subsistence agriculture is focused on that labor, and that's why it's called labor intensive. Okay, the only agricultures that you need to know characteristically and where they are on the map are market gardening, plantation gardening, mixed crop and livestock, Mediterranean, shifting cultivation, pastoral nomadism, and ranching. And I'm going to go through each of these different types of agriculture, but it's important to understand how to identify these agricultures. Not just where they are in the world, but are they extensive or intensive? Are they capital intensive or labor intensive? And are they commercial and subsistence? And then, of course, you have to be able to tie them to climates based on latitude lines, because if you have one type of farming in one place in the world, you can follow that latitude line and find it in other places. So it's important to understand the different climates and what to expect. Like, you're not going to talk about pastoral nomadism, which takes place in arid, dry climates. You're not going to have that near the equator in a tropical rainforest. It just doesn't make sense. So understand when these different types of agricultures talk about their climate, that you're able to associate that to a map and think about that where that is. So the first one that we're going to talk about on our intensive agricultures are the mixed crop and livestock. So the mixed crop and livestock is a little bit similar to pastoral nomadism in the fact that you are going to raise animals and you can use them for their byproduct. That's going to be the goal here, but you can also raise them to slaughter them. But what makes mixed crop and livestock so unique is that they're growing the food for the animals on the farm. So all the corn and all the hay that they grow are predominantly for the animals, whether it be for milking them afterwards or for growing and slaughtering them. And because mixed crop and livestock feedlots are so many across the United States, I guess is the best word. That's why we have the most corn grown in the United States, is because we use it for animal feed. Now, market gardening or truck farming is another type, or commercial gardening is another form of intensive agriculture. It's going to focus mainly on growing fruits and vegetables, and this takes place in the southeast part of the United States. It's what we know because we're very used to the oranges and strawberries and stuff like that. Now, plantation agriculture is interesting because the first two that we've talked about, all of these that we've talked about so far are commercial agriculture. But in truck farming and in mixed crop and livestock, it's very capital intensive. We're using a lot of machines. But plantation agriculture is different than other commercial agricultures because, one, it's generally found in the developing world in tropical climates near the equator in these developing or even high developing countries. And the reason that they exist there is because the companies in the developed world are going to buy land in these areas, they're going to take advantage of the cheap land, the cheap labor, and this is kind of reminiscent on the core periphery or Wallerstein's world systems theory, giving us more evidence towards that because they are utilizing these cheap site factors in the developing world. So plantations also generally focus on one or two cash crops. These are crops that aren't necessary for day-to-day life. These are luxury crops, so they're worth a lot of money. And developing countries will try to sell cash crops to boost their export-oriented economy, similar to what they did in colonialism when they used to export their raw materials. But now they realize that, the old colonizers still want to eat bananas and drink coffee, eat, chocolate, drink tea, coconuts, palm oil. So they realize that they can harvest this stuff and sell it to them if the corporations haven't bought out their land and control it anyway. All right, so next is our Mediterranean agriculture. Now, Mediterranean agriculture focuses on growing fruits and vegetables, herbs. It can also be called horticulture. Now, what's unique about Mediterranean agriculture and this intensive type of agriculture is that it needs the perfect climate for this to exist, and it is the climate of the Mediterranean Ocean. Sea? Ocean? Whatever. It's the Mediterranean. So, needless to say, a lot of the food that we think of from that area only grows there because it is uniquely grown in that area. Things like olives, grapes, lentils, tomatoes, other types of vegetables, especially grapes for wine, all come from the Mediterranean. Now we start getting to our extensive agriculture, our larger agricultures. Our first one is shifting cultivation, better known as slash and burn. Now in these areas, the slashing and burning serves two purposes. The slashing down the trees creates the land for them to grow food, but by burning the trees, it creates a nutrient-rich topsoil. Then you have crops you can plant crops that have tons of nutrition in the soil, and they can do multiple years of growing crops. And then when it runs out, they can shift to a new area and start the process over again. Now, when they shift to a new area, when they shift to a new chunk of land where they will clear trees, burn them, grow food, the old plot of land will eventually come back naturally. So over time, it was a sustainable way in the past of having farms throughout places with heavily dense rainforests. But today it's very difficult to do because populations are growing more and more and countries are trying to figure out how to make money. And doing subsistence agriculture in an extensive form of shifting cultivation just isn't a good idea to feed people. I don't know how else to put it. So shifting cultivation generally takes place in rainforested areas. So think of the Amazon rainforest, think of Central Africa, Papua New Guinea, out in Oceania has one too. But these are the two main places where you'll see shifting cultivation take place. Then we get to pastoral nomadism. Pastoral nomads are animal herders that roll around in arid climates with their animals. And the goal here is to raise them and take care of them for the byproducts. Now, the reason why they are nomads and they herd with them is because they have to move with the grasslands. And a special movement to the pastoral nomads is called transhumance. It's that seasonal migration from highlands to lowlands, so these animals always have food. Now, as I said, it's for their byproducts. They're not raising these animals to eventually slaughter them because you're eliminating your food source. So what they do is that they raise them for the byproducts, the dairy products, and then trade those away for whatever they need with whatever surplus they have. Now, also remember, these take place in dry, arid climates, right? Very similar to not there yet. Anyway, as I said, it's arid climates with little to no rain, so they can't grow crops there, but a lot of grass does. And there, as I wanted to transition on the last slide, we get to ranching. Another climate very similar to pastoral nomadism. It's an extensive form of agriculture. It isn't an arid climate, but the difference is that this is commercial agriculture while pastoral nomadism was subsistence agriculture. And that also leads to the different purpose behind this type of agriculture. Because pastoral nomadism is a subsistence agriculture where they want to raise animals to constantly use them to feed themselves, where livestock ranching is similar to pastoral nomadism because it's extensive and you're raising animals, but it's similar to mixed crop and livestock because the goal eventually is to slaughter those animals. So in this extensive agriculture in these arid climates, animals have tons and tons of room to walk around and graze on grass, and then eventually they'll be sent to a feedlot, and at the feedlot they're going to take in a lot of food over the next couple months to get them really, really fat before they're sold off to be slaughtered. Now, as I said, it is similar to pastoral nomadism because of the climate. And ranching is found predominantly in North America, the western part of North America, Southeast Latin America. Argentina has a huge ranching industry, along with parts of Brazil. And that's why they're clearing so many forests, but we'll talk more about that in a second. Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Pacific. So then we get to the von Thunen model. So we've talked about where agriculture has come from, we've talked about the different types of agriculture, and we've talked about where in the world they're placed. But now we have to think about, in aspects of cities and civilization, where are we going to place different types of agriculture based off the needs of each type of agriculture. So von Thunen's model is based on a couple things, where farmers place their type of agriculture in relation to the city. And it's based off the land cost, the transportation cost, and how much they'll profit. Right? Heavy and expensive to transport items are closer to the city. We're thinking of dairy and forestry. Whereas crops that need a lot of land are placed further away from the city. Because remember, things like dairy or vegetables don't need as much room as, wheat and cows to graze. And the stuff goes bad, so you want to keep it near the city. And trees are really heavy, and when trees are the only way that you're going to make stuff, buildings and civilization, you want to keep the trees close that you will then harvest. Where you can go further away from a city, and cows have legs, so once they get big enough, you can just walk them into the city to be slaughtered. And we use this really confusing graph to talk about bid rent, because we know land that's closer to the city is going to be more expensive and land far away from the city is going to be cheaper. So it only makes sense for the farmers that need lots and lots of land to be further away from the city so they can still make a profit, while agricultures that don't need a whole lot of land can be closer to the city because they can survive that, and it's good for their crops because their stuff can go bad. But there are a couple problems with von Thunen's model. The fact that he wrote it in the 1800s. Obviously, modern forestry isn't around, modern transportation isn't around, refrigeration doesn't exist, so you have to keep dairy near cities. So while von Thunen's model doesn't really matter anymore because we have so many technological advances, it still makes us think about, when we place cities and place our types of agriculture, that it's something to keep in mind. Now, this is a really pixelated picture, and I apologize, but if we laid out von Thunen's model over the United States, it still holds up, because our population center, or at least one of them, is in the Northeast United States. And there are a lot of dairy farms in that northern part of the U.S., and as you move further away from it, you move to the types of agriculture that needs a lot more room. When you talk about corn and soybeans and wheat, and especially beef cattle and sheep, they need tons and tons of room. So you could use this model to explain why we have different agricultures in the U.S. and where they are. And especially when it comes to the Midwest, when we have so much land that we can turn to those extensive forms of agriculture. So we know where our farms go in relation to cities, but how do we organize the land itself? And there's three ways. There's the meets and bounds, which is, the weird drawings from specific points on a map. And then we get the township and sections, where when we have large chunks of land, we can evenly distribute it into townships and sections. You're going to see a picture on it in a second. And then you have the French long lot system, where you have long, thin strips of farms, because every farm needs to touch the water or road so they have access to trade for their crops. So this first picture is the meets and bounds. You're going to use it by indicating landmarks like an oak tree or a spring hill, and then you're going to figure out the distance in between it to mark off the land that people would own. The township and range, this idea is that because you have tons of flat land, you can just mark everything off in perfect little squares. And then finally, you have the French long lot system, where you have these long, thin farms that all have access to that river being the Mississippi. So it makes sense that you would want every farm to touch that so that, they could sell stuff and easily transport them down the river. So we know where farms go, we know how to divide farmland now, but what happens when the landscape isn't perfect? Because von Thunen's model has this idea that there's no mountains, that there's no different types of land, that all of it's fertile. So what happens when we run into problems? Well, one of the things that we can do is terracing. Say we run into a mountain or a hill, well, we can create flat surfaces on the mountains and increase the area in which we can farm. This is easy for farmers. They can do it with hand tools. It collects rainfall better. It can sustain crops. It stops erosion. But if it's not maintained, you get deadly mudslides and people die. So, double-edged sword here. Now, this did originate in East Asia with rice farming, but you can find it all around the world. You can find it in Northern Africa. You can find it in South America. It's something that can be utilized for all types of agriculture. So say that you are in a place that doesn't have water. Well, then you turn to irrigation. And some of the oldest irrigation systems are in the top right-hand corner that we see in Egypt and Mesopotamia, where you simply just dig, trenches, near your crops and have water on a slight incline delivered to those crops. And then as we became more advanced, we created huge irrigation systems that you'd see on the bottom left. Sorry. And we use these to get water to cities. And then finally, we have modern irrigation techniques used by sprinkler systems and stuff like that. But what's dangerous about collecting groundwater, in the first two examples, it moved water from bodies of water far away. Now with modern irrigation techniques, we are bringing up groundwater from underneath the earth. And that can lead to salinization of the soil, getting too much salt in it. And it can also lead to the land to collapse because you're draining all the water from underneath it. Another thing we can do with agriculture is say we have too many wetlands. We can actually drain the water from wetlands, which fortunately creates a very nutrient-rich land. We can increase the carrying capacity of the land. We can have more people there. The downside, though, is that when you drain wetlands, you have a reduction in the biodiversity, the plants and the animals and the environment that naturally happens there, and it can have some unintended consequences. That's why today we try to preserve wetlands, not drain so many to push more agriculture. And then finally, and we definitely see this in the Amazon rainforest, especially by Brazil, this deforestation thing, because if you have so many trees and you need more farms, then you're going to cut down trees. And this isn't the same as cutting down and burning them for slash and burn. We are literally cutting them down, selling the lumber, and then using what soil is left over. But if you use the soil too much, it can create desertification and create a desert. On top of that, these trees are originally used to absorb carbon dioxide, and without those trees, we can have more carbon dioxide in the air, especially if you take all of these problems and then you go, okay, well, I'm going to cut down these trees, sell the lumber, overuse the soil, and then put cows there for ranching purposes. And now you're just releasing more gases into the air. So while we have overcome environmental problems not outlined by von Thunen's model, and possibilism is great, and we have all these amazing ways to feed people, we do have to realize that there are some consequences of massive agricultural industry. Which then takes us to agribusiness. Agribusiness is the key word for commercial agriculture, or super complex globalized agriculture that exists today. So agribusiness surrounds and supports large-scale agriculture. So these farmers that you see with huge farms, they turn to different agribusinesses to help them, they buy technology, fertilizers, food processors, materials, whatever they need to grow what they grow and sell what they sell. So a lack of agribusiness can stifle new types of agriculture. Agribusiness, all the surrounding industries, kind of decide what food is going to be grown or not. And this leads to the impact of corporate farming. So due to modern transportation and businesses, corporate farms are becoming more and more common throughout the world. It's when large corporations buy up multiple farms and many different parts of the agribusiness process, for example with Tyson Farms. So Tyson Chicken owned the farms, the feed, the truck, the eggs, the processing facility, the bagging, everything from A to Z. So now we have this big company producing our food far, far away and shipping it all around the United States and us. And it causes a drop in local family-owned farms. They cannot compete with these big corporate farms, especially when we want cheaper and cheaper food, and with cheaper and cheaper food, we want more and more food. So we see the rise of these corporate farms. Now, when we talk about corporate farms and agribusiness, we talk about the supply chain or the commodity chain. The fact is that food doesn't just pop up on a farm and it's in the grocery store. It starts with having the seeds, fertilizer, and water, then being transported to the farm to grow and to harvest, then being transported to the factory for processing, and then being transported to the market to be sold. And because of globalization, transportation technologies, agricultural technologies, all of this stuff can be done all around the world, so we can constantly have the foods we want year round instead of waiting for seasonal foods. Because I want guacamole year round, I love avocados, and luckily because we live in a world with supply chains and commodity chains, this stuff, we always have access to it. Talking about some of the technologies that let this happen, the fact is that we love going to the grocery store and always seeing bananas and avocados and strawberries and our cash crops and pineapples, and we just can't live without them anymore. So how do we get it year round? Because those are things that are in season. Well, cool chains. We talked about these plantations being in tropical climates in other parts of the world, but how does it get here and still, it's still fresh? The fact is, and it seems silly, but refrigerators. And it's not the refrigerators in your living room. We have now made refrigerated trucks. We have refrigerated, shipping containers, and we have refrigerated airplanes. So now we can get all of this food to people year round anywhere in the world. Now, if a company owns every step in the supply chain, like say Tyson Chicken, for example, it's called vertical integration. They own every step of the process, so they get to dictate the prices of everything. So what are the problems with global agribusiness? Because while it is awesome that we can get everything we want year round, it does have an impact on the world, especially those countries that are producing the food. So farmers who are producing crops they can't afford to consume to grow. Think the chocolate farmers. The fact that there's people in this world growing the cacao bean and have no idea that it's turned into delicious chocolate is absolutely mind-blowing, and they couldn't afford it if they wanted to. Farmers focus on exporting crops and not growing crops for local consumption. The fact is they can make more money growing cash crops, so they're going to keep pushing more and more cash crops, which creates a monoculture, which if something happens to their crop and destroys everything, they have nothing. And it also creates an issue because now they're not growing the crops to feed their family, they have a less diverse diet, and now they have to buy food from other countries, which is what they used to grow before. So we see the rise of cash crops being grown and sold, like the cacao, bananas, avocados, and coffee, and a reduction in things you can live off of, like lentils, wheat, and corn. And then on top of that, because the developing world is so trapped into debt by major corporations, big agribusinesses and stuff like that for technologies, they push their land harder and harder and harder, and it leads to unsustainable agricultural practices. So now these farmers are in more debt, and they're draining the land of their only way of making money. So this turns to the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution really led into what I previously talked about, the developing world pushing more of these cash crops. Because at first this was a great agricultural revolution. It was a way that people around the world could grow more staple crops in the same amount of land using mechanization, irrigation technologies, artificial pesticides, chemical pesticides, and high-yield variety seeds. These GMOs that could produce just a lot of food, but it required a lot more water and a lot more fertilizer. So it's great because it's able to prevent massive famines. India goes from a net importer to a net exporter of food. But at the same time, it also had drawbacks as people go, well, I can't make money off wheat, but I can make more money off, a cash crop like mustard seed. And this takes me to the positives and negatives of the Green Revolution. The first positive, obviously, is that we have higher yields of staple crops and we can fight off global hunger. The money that's generated for food research and businesses, global markets have new agriculture inventions, and people can make more food and more money. And then finally, food prices in the world start to drop because we have a huge influx of supply from other countries. So those are three very good positives for the Green Revolution, but unfortunately there's a lot of negatives. So the first negative is that these increased yields put a drain on the land. People are double cropping, that means 2 harvests per season, and the aggressive irrigation leads to soil erosion, destroying the topsoil, draining the soil of all its nutrients, so now they cannot grow crops. The reliance on human-made fertilizers is expensive, especially in the developing world, and these human-made fertilizers run off and pollute drinking water and ecosystems in local nearby rivers. Now, due to the higher yields, farmers have to use massive amounts of machinery. The Green Revolution is only capable of growing all this food if you use really aggressive irrigation, lots of fertilizer, and then you grow all these crops. Well, you have to use machines to harvest them all because humans can't do it. So now you're bringing in all these machines, which are creating more air pollution from the fossil fuel use. And then finally, who pays for it? Because at first in these developing nations, governments did. And that's great because now these poor farmers can feed the country. But eventually the cost is pushed onto the farmers and they don't have money growing these staple crops to pay for all this Green Revolution technology. So they switch to cash crops, specifically mustard seed in India, which then creates a monoculture. And now they have to import food because they're only exporting cash crops, which leads us back to our original problem before the Green Revolution. And then finally, and one of the most detrimental things to development is that only men were taught how to use these new tools and machines, which hold back women from owning farms, making money off of farms, developing, paying kids to go to school, and the whole development story. So of course there's some environmental problems. I've already mentioned some of them, but because of urban sprawl, just sprawling out the urban area, the suburbs, to put houses wherever we want, we really cut down on the places that we can have farms. Topsoil loss is when you drain the nutrients out of the soil too much from aggressive growing. Desertification is turning soil into literally a desert, into an arid place, generally as a result of livestock ranching and pastoral nomadism, what we're seeing in Brazil with the cutting of all the trees through excessive lumbering and then starting ranches. And then salinization, once again, when you just irrigate too much and you bring salt up to the soil and destroy the water and soil. So what can we do about all of this corporate farming and aggressive farming and unsustainable agriculture? Because, GMOs are great and fertilizers are great, but we are pushing the earth too hard. So now people have started to pivot to organic farming. Obviously, not very popular based on the graph, but there are some merits to it. One, there's more demand for organic products for a number of reasons. Consumers want an alternative. They're wary of insecticides and herbicides and fertilizers and GMOs. People are scared of what they don't know. And the fact is that places like the United States have a lot more wealth, so they can afford organic products. They have this disposable income to use. And people concerned about the treatment of animals, they think that the advertising for organic products is appealing, and there's more and more supermarkets dedicated to organic food. So this is leading to the perfect spot for more organic foods to exist and creating a market for farmers to grow this and actually make some money. Organic agriculture takes better care of the land. The fact is that they sustain it better. It doesn't exhaust the land through using extra chemicals or heavy irrigation, and they're not forced to either. So consumers want to eat stuff that have a less impact or negative impact on the environment. And consumers don't want to see things like the overuse of fertilizers and pesticides, and that's why they're turning to organically grown food. And then finally, we've seen a rise of organic farming because this is a possibility for small farms to stay alive. Small farms can't compete with big corporate farms. They can't pump out enough food. But if they can start an organic farm and they can send out that small organic food, they can now make a living in the face of corporate farming and not fall to big corporations, right? So that's a really I'd say the biggest benefit to the organic food movement is that these small family farms can stay open and they can still sell directly to the community. And this takes me to community supported agriculture, or CSA. What some farms are doing now is trying to connect the consumer to the farm. And what they do is that they have local consumers subscribe to that farm. So when the farm reaches out to them, they go, hey, this is what's being harvested. Hey, this is what we're doing right now. Thank you for investing in us. And then the consumers come, they buy directly from the farmers. They don't go to a grocery store. They know where their food's coming from. They know it's organic. And then the small family farms can stay in business. They have outreach to the community. Sometimes the community comes in and works in exchange for food, and it promotes organic small family farms. But of course, not everybody in the developed world has it all easy and can just go, to their local farmer or their local grocery store, because we have the problem of food deserts. It's urban areas that lack access to grocery stores with fresh fruits, vegetables, meats, and other foodstuffs. And in fact, from the chart, it says 23.5 million people live in urban neighborhoods or rural towns with limited access to fresh food, right? The fact that they don't have a car to drive to the nearest place, or that low-income zip codes have more than 30% of convenience stores. And we know that convenience stores aren't selling fresh food, fresh vegetables, fresh meats. And if they are, it's very expensive. And what is there in place is instead of fast food. And this leads to developmental problems in a country, dropping HDI numbers, so on and so forth. There are other solutions to food deserts, besides subsidizing and creating grocery stores, because that's the goal. That would be the best if grocery stores learn to exist in those areas. But some other solutions are urban agriculture, the practice of cultivating, processing, and distributing food in an urban area. People will put gardens in their front lawn or on rooftops if that's what they have to do to survive. And they can become very creative when it comes to it. They can even raise animals or fish or beekeeping to make sure that they can still have food. So what do you need to know? Literally everything from Unit 5 and how it connects to all the other stuff. I know I've said this at the end of the video, but it really is up to you now to decide if you are truly understanding this content and being able to paint this big picture of AP Human Geography and looking at different parts of the world and going, do I understand the development that's going on here? What are the forces acting on this country? What's going on agriculturally? What's going on industrially? What's going on with political geography? How is their population statistics or their demographics being used? And what are the impacts of all their decisions? Because that's how you really start to bring things together. So, as always, if you could hit that like button, make sure you hit subscribe and hit the bell icon to know when I drop new videos on YouTube. As always, this is Bear's Guide to a 5. We'll see you next time.